Between June 14th and June 18th of this year, 8 separate witnesses reported encounters with an unidentified marine entity along Florida's Atlantic coastline. These reports came from tourists, experienced watermen, and Coast Guard personnel. Each sighting moved progressively southward. Each witness described movement patterns inconsistent with known marine life. But the 8th encounter, the one that occurred at a public pier in broad daylight with multiple cameras recording from fixed positions, captured something that has marine biologists refusing to go on record. 5 days, 8 sightings, 1 coastline. This is what happened. Florida's coastline measures 1,350 miles. No state in the continental United States, except Alaska, offers more interface between human activity and open ocean. This isn't incidental geography, it's a threshold. Where land meets water, the known meets the unknown with unusual frequency. The Spanish documented it first. In 1560, conquistador Alvaro Mexia recorded an encounter off what is now the Tampa Bay area. His log describes women of the sea with the tail of a great fish. Mexia was a trained military observer. He'd spent 3 years sailing Caribbean waters. His documentation of supplies, positions, and indigenous populations proved reliable enough that modern historians use his logs for archaeological research. Yet he devoted 4 pages to describing an encounter his crew witnessed at dawn, detailing skin tone, hair length, and movement patterns that defied explanation. Mexia did what witnesses still do today. He offered the explanation available to him. Perhaps a new form of Indian, he wrote, adapted to the sea. The indigenous Calusa people had no such uncertainty. Their oral traditions, documented by Spanish missionaries before the tribe's extinction in the 1700s, spoke plainly of water people who lived in the deep channels between barrier islands. These weren't metaphors. The Calusa were master mariners who engineered canals, built houses on stilts, and understood tidal patterns well enough to construct sophisticated fish traps. They knew manatees, they knew dolphins, they knew sea turtles and sharks and every creature that moved through their waters. They described something else entirely. By 1493, Christopher Columbus had provided European culture with an explanation that would persist for centuries. The Mermaid was a manatee, glimpsed by exhausted sailors who wanted to see women where only animals existed. It's a convenient dismissal. West Indian manatees do inhabit Florida waters, approximately 8,800 animals according to current fish and wildlife counts. They surface to breathe. They have front flippers that, under specific lighting conditions and at considerable distance, might suggest arms. Their faces, if you're generous and desperate, carry an almost mammalian softness. But a manatee moves differently. It drifts. It grazes on seagrass in shallow water. It doesn't bolt. It doesn't exhibit curiosity. It doesn't pace a boat. The witnesses who came forward during those 5 days in June knew what manatees looked like. Some of them had seen manatees that same week. What they reported wasn't a manatee. Florida carries this history in its place names and tourist attractions. Weeki Wachee Springs has employed mermaids, women in costume, performing underwater choreography since 1947. 3 generations of Florida children grew up visiting the attraction, watching women with artificial tails swim behind glass. The cultural imprint runs deep. When something unusual appears in the water, the mind reaches for available frameworks. The question isn't whether Florida's coastline predisposes people to interpret ambiguous sightings through a mermaid lens. The question is, what happens when the sighting isn't ambiguous? The Gulf Stream runs closer to Florida's Atlantic coast than anywhere else in North America. This river of warm Caribbean water creates unique marine conditions, unusual thermal layers, unexpected currents, ecosystem boundaries where tropical species meet temperate ones. Marine biologists working these waters expect surprises. species thought to range no farther north than the Bahamas appear off Palm Beach. Deep water creatures surface in shallow zones. The Gulf Stream creates portals, bringing the deep ocean's mysteries directly to Florida's beaches. On June 14th, something used that portal. The first witness was a tourist from Ohio. She'd never seen the ocean before this trip. She had no framework for mermaids beyond Disney movies and the Weeki-Wachee billboards she'd passed on I-75. Her boyfriend filmed 73 seconds of footage at dawn on Clearwater Beach while she stood waist-deep in bathwater warm surf and described what she was seeing 20 yards offshore. "It's watching me," she said. The footage shows dark water, early light, and something breaking the surface that moves back under before the phone's autofocus can resolve it into clarity. By itself, the footage proves nothing. But she was first. She didn't know that 40 miles south, a surfer was about to see the same thing. She didn't know that a charter captain with 30 years on these waters would risk his reputation 3 days later describing movement patterns that matched hers exactly. She didn't know she'd started documenting a pattern. June 14th, 6:47 a.m. Clearwater Beach, Florida. Amanda Vescio, 23 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, walked into the Gulf of Mexico for the first time in her life. The water temperature measured 79 degrees, warm enough that she'd waded out in a t-shirt and shorts without hesitation. Her boyfriend, Marcus Chen, stayed on shore filming her reaction to the ocean. The timestamp on his video confirms the time. The tide was going out. She got 15 feet from shore when she stopped. "There's something out there," she said. On the video you can hear Marcus assume she means a fish. "That's the ocean, babe. There's lots of somethings." "No, she pointed, "it's looking at me." The camera swings from Amanda to the water she's indicating. Early morning light creates glare on the surface. The autofocus hunts, can't lock on. For 3 seconds, the frame shows nothing but rippled water and lens flare. Then something dark surfaces approximately 20 yards offshore. The object, and at this distance and resolution, it's only an object, breaks the waterline for perhaps 2 seconds. The autofocus is still hunting. By the time the image sharpens, the object has submerged. What remains is a ring of disturbed water, dissipating. "Did you see it?" Amanda's voice pitches higher. Marcus zoomed. The phone's digital zoom pixelates the image into uselessness, but he held the frame steady for another 40 seconds, recording empty water while Amanda described what she'd seen. "It had a face," she said. "It was looking right at me." The couple left the beach shortly after. They didn't report the sighting to anyone official. Marcus posted the video to his Instagram story with the caption, "Clearwater Beach is wild," and forgot about it until 3 days later when the local news started asking for footage. The video accumulated 43 views. Nobody paid attention. 38 miles south near the mouth of Tampa Bay, a different kind of witness was paddling out for a dawn session. June 15th, 6:20 a.m. Ryan Delgado had surfed the Tampa Bay area for 16 years. At 34, he worked as a medical equipment technician, a job that required precision, documentation, and skepticism. He surfed Gandy Beach most mornings before his shift, familiar enough with the break that he could read the sets in darkness. The sun wasn't up yet. Delgado sat on his board in chest-deep water, waiting. The tide was transitioning, not ideal, but the forecast called for afternoon thunderstorms, and this was his window. Something surfaced 6 feet to his left. Delgado's first assumption was dolphin. Dolphins frequent Tampa Bay, sometimes swimming close enough to surfers that you can hear them breathe. But dolphins surface with a roll, dorsal fin, back, tail in sequence. This was different. This was a head and shoulders. Delgado didn't get a good look. The light was wrong, the angle was wrong, and the entire sighting lasted 3 seconds before the thing dropped back under. But 3 details stuck with him. First, the silhouette was vertical in the water, not a dolphin's horizontal surfacing. Second, he heard no breath. Dolphins exhale explosively through their blowholes. Whatever this was, it surfaced silently. Third, after it went under, he felt movement in the water, not waves, but displacement, something large changing position below him. He paddled to shore immediately. Delgado told 2 people, his wife and his closest friend, also a surfer. He didn't file a report. He didn't post about it. When asked later why, he'd stayed silent. He was direct. "I work in a hospital. I calibrate diagnostic equipment. If my coworkers think I'm seeing mermaids, that affects my credibility." He sat on the sighting for 3 days, until the pattern became undeniable, and a local news station put out a call for witnesses. Even then, he requested anonymity for the broadcast interview. His description, recorded on June 19th, matched details he'd written in his phone's notes app on June 15th, documentation he'd created not to report, but to remember accurately. 2 sightings, 2 days, both dawn. Both along Florida's central Gulf Coast. Amanda Vecchio saw something watching her from 20 yards out. Ryan Delgado had something surface within arm's reach. Neither witness knew the other existed. Neither had reason to coordinate stories or seek attention. Vecchio posted casually to social media and moved on. Delgado told no one beyond his immediate circle. The encounters shared structural elements: warm water, outgoing tide, low light, brief duration. Both witnesses described a moment of recognition, the sense of being observed, followed by immediate retreat by the entity. Neither sighting produced clear footage or physical evidence. Both witnesses reported the encounter with reluctance or indifference. By themselves, the reports meant nothing. But 48 hours later, off the coast of Sarasota, a fishing charter captain with 3 decades of experience was about to see the same thing, and he wouldn't stay quiet. The third encounter didn't come from a tourist with a smartphone or a surfer still processing what he'd seen in the pre-dawn darkness. It came from Captain Thomas Reinhardt, a fishing charter operator who'd worked the waters between Tarpon Springs and Hudson for 31 years. Reinhardt filed his report with the Pasco County Sheriff's Office at 2:47 p.m. on June 17th. The decision to go on record took him 4 hours. He'd returned to dock at 10:30 that morning and sat in his truck in the marina parking lot, engine off, trying to decide whether what he'd witnessed was worth the inevitable consequences. He knew what happened to people who reported things like this. He'd watched colleagues become punchlines after unusual sightings. One captain who'd reported strange lights over the Gulf in 2019 lost 3 corporate clients within a week. The charter business runs on reputation, and reputation is fragile. But Reinhardt also understood something about the water that most people don't spend enough time on it to learn. He knew the rhythm of tarpon rolling at the surface, the explosive breach of a sturgeon, the way dolphins move when they're hunting versus when they're playing. He knew the specific physics of how marine animals displace water, the patterns they create, the sounds they make. What he saw that morning matched none of it. His charter that day had been a family of 4 from Atlanta, father, mother, 2 teenage daughters. They'd gone out at 6:15 a.m. targeting grouper and snapper near a reef structure Reinhardt had fished for decades. The water was calm, visibility good, air temperature already climbing toward the mid-80s. At approximately 8:20 a.m., according to the timestamp on the boat's GPS log, Reinhardt's daughter, Ashley, who was trailing a line off the stern, said she saw something surface about 40 yards northwest of their position. Reinhardt's first assumption was dolphin. Bottlenose dolphins are abundant in these waters, and they're curious about boats. But the movement was wrong. Dolphins surface in a rolling arc, dorsal fin first, then the curve of the back, then the tail. This was vertical. Something rose straight up, paused at the surface, and sank straight back down. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Reinhardt cut the engine. The family was looking at their phones, hadn't noticed. Ashley was staring at the spot where the thing had surfaced, her fishing rod forgotten. Reinhardt asked her what she'd seen. She said she didn't know, but it had a head. They waited. The water was flat enough that any surface disturbance would be visible. For 2 minutes, nothing. Then the father said he saw something moving underwater, maybe 20 yards out, heading south parallel to the boat. Reinhardt saw it too, not the thing itself, but the displacement pattern it created, a V-shaped wake moving just beneath the surface, like what you'd see from a large fish swimming fast and shallow. Except the wake was too narrow for a tarpon and moving faster than a tarpon moves when it's not actively fleeing. Then it turned. Not a gradual arc, but an abrupt 90-degree pivot that brought it directly toward the boat. Reinhardt has been charged by bull sharks before. He knows what it looks like when something large and fast is coming at you underwater. This had the same forward momentum, the same directional commitment, but it was moving at the wrong depth. Sharks that size, and the wake suggested something at least 6 feet long, don't maintain position 3 feet below the surface when they're moving that fast. They either go deeper or commit to the surface. This stayed exactly 3 feet down, and it was accelerating. At 10 yards out, it dove. The wake collapsed, the water went still, and whatever had been approaching simply disappeared into deeper water. Reinhardt started the engine and moved the boat 50 yards east. Nobody spoke. The mother asked if they should head in. Reinhardt said yes. Back at the dock, the family thanked him and left. Ashley asked him what he thought it was. Reinhardt told her he didn't know, but he didn't like how it moved. She asked if he was going to report it. He said he'd think about it. For 4 hours, he thought about it. He thought about the bills, the boat payment, the summer season that was just getting started. He thought about his reputation and what happened to people who filed reports like this. He also thought about the way that thing had turned toward the boat, the deliberate geometry of that movement, and the fact that it had dove at exactly the moment before he would have been able to see what it was. At 2:47 p.m., he walked into the Pasco County Sheriff's Office and asked to file a marine incident report. The deputy who took his statement was professional and thorough. Reinhardt provided the GPS coordinates, the timestamp, a description of the movement pattern, and the names of his charter clients as potential corroborating witnesses. The deputy asked if he'd taken any photographs or video. Reinhardt said no. The deputy asked what he thought it was. Reinhardt said he'd been working these waters for 31 years, and he had no idea, but it wasn't a dolphin, it wasn't a shark, and it wasn't a tarpon. The deputy wrote that down. By 6 p.m. that evening, Reinhardt's report had been forwarded to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. By 9 p.m., someone had leaked it to a local fishing forum. By midnight, Captain Thomas Reinhardt's name was attached to the phrase "Mermaid sighting," and the thing he'd spent 4 hours deciding to do became the thing he couldn't undo. What Reinhardt didn't know, what nobody knew yet on June 17th, was that his sighting had established something critical. The first 2 encounters had been brief, distant, ambiguous. His was detailed, documented, and filed through official channels by a witness whose professional credibility could be verified. It was also the last sighting that would occur in relatively open water. The next encounter would involve authorities, and the pattern that was beginning to emerge along Florida's Atlantic coast was about to shift from speculation to active investigation. The United States Coast Guard Station Fort Myers Beach operates 4 45-foot response boat mediums and 2 29-foot response boat smalls. On June 18th at approximately 10:15 a.m., RB-M 45607 was conducting a routine navigational safety patrol approximately 12 nautical miles southwest of Fort Myers Beach, when Petty Officer Second Class Jennifer Cahill reported an unidentified marine contact. The official incident report, filed at 11:02 a.m. and later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, contains 3 sentences. It describes a possible marine mammal observed at bearing 187 degrees, relative to vessel position, estimated distance 40 meters, duration of observation approximately 8 seconds. The report notes that the contact submerged before positive identification could be made and was not relocated despite a methodical search pattern conducted over the subsequent 23 minutes. What the report doesn't contain is what Petty Officer Kahali told her crewmates immediately after the sighting, or what she later told investigators during the internal review that was quietly initiated 2 days later when a pattern analyst at Coast Guard District 7 headquarters in Miami noticed that her sighting coordinates fell along the same northward coastal track as 3 prior civilian reports. Kahali had been standing watch on the forward deck, conducting a visual sweep, when she saw something surface near the boat's starboard side. Her first thought was, dolphin. Bottlenose dolphins frequently approach Coast Guard vessels out of curiosity. But dolphins surface in a specific way, a rolling motion that Kahali, who'd served on Marine Patrol for 4 years, had observed thousands of times. This surfaced differently. It rose vertically, broke the waterline from approximately chest height, paused for what Kahali estimated was 2 to 3 seconds, then descended straight down without the rolling motion characteristic of marine mammals. In those 2 to 3 seconds, Kahali observed several details that she included in her verbal report to the boat's commanding officer, Boatswain's Mate First Class Michael Torres, but which did not appear in the written incident report. The contact had a defined head and shoulder structure. It was oriented toward the vessel. The coloring was pale gray or gray-green, consistent with marine mammal skin pigmentation, but the shape of the head was wrong for any species Kahali had been trained to identify. When it submerged, it did so without forward or backward motion. It sank vertically, which created a surface disturbance pattern unlike what dolphins or seals produce when diving. Torres, who was at the helm when Kahali called out the sighting, saw only the final second of the sequence, a dark shape disappearing beneath the surface and the circular ripple pattern it left behind. He immediately reduced speed and initiated a search protocol. The 2 other crew members aboard, Seaman Marcus Delgado and Petty Officer 3rd Class Amanda Howell, moved to the gunwales to assist in visual scanning. For 23 minutes, RB-M 45607 executed a standard lost object search pattern crisscrossing the area where the contact had been observed. The water depth in that location was approximately 60 feet. Visibility was good and sea state was calm. They saw nothing. Torres logged the incident as an unidentified marine mammal contact and resumed the scheduled patrol route. But something about the sighting bothered Kahali enough that when the boat returned to station at 3:40 p.m., she asked to speak with Torres privately. She told him she didn't think what she'd seen was a dolphin or a seal. Torres asked what she thought it was. Kahali said she didn't know, but the way it had surfaced and the way it had looked directly at the boat before submerging felt deliberate in a way that made her uncomfortable. Torres asked if she wanted to file an expanded report. Kahali said no. She was aware of how these things played out. Unusual sighting reports created paperwork, questions, and the kind of attention that could stall a career. Torres told her to think about it, and if she changed her mind, he'd support a supplemental filing. She didn't change her mind. But Torres did something that technically fell outside standard protocol. He sent an email to the Operations Center at District 7 headquarters describing the incident in more detail than the official report contained, and noting that the sighting location fell along Florida's southwest coast in an area that had seen increased marine activity reports over the prior 72 hours. That email reached Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss, a pattern analyst who monitors unusual incident reports across the district's area of responsibility. Voss pulled the civilian reports from June 15th, 16th, and 17th, the tourist footage from Clearwater, the surfers' encounter near Tampa Bay, and Captain Reinhardt's detailed statement to the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. She plotted all 4 sighting coordinates on a chart. The pattern was immediately apparent. 4 sightings over 4 days, each one occurring roughly 30 to 40 miles south of the previous one, creating a clear directional track down Florida's Gulf Coast. Voss initiated what's called a Marine Environmental Anomaly Watch, a low-level monitoring protocol typically used for tracking unusual algae blooms, marine mammal die-offs, or navigation hazards. It required Coast Guard stations from Tampa Bay to Key West to flag any additional reports of unusual marine contacts and forward them to her office for pattern analysis. At 4:17 p.m. on June 18th, she received a second report. This one came from a recreational boater near Sanibel Island, who'd called the Coast Guard's emergency line to report what he described as something that looked like a person swimming offshore in an area where the current and water temperature would make human survival unlikely. A Coast Guard response boat reached the reported location within 18 minutes. They found no one. The search continued until dark. The boater's description was detailed enough: pale skin, dark hair, vertical swimming motion, that the incident was classified as a possible person-in-water emergency until the search was called off at 8:45 p.m. with no evidence of anyone missing or in distress. Voss added that sighting to her chart. 5 incidents in 4 days, all falling along a consistent southward track. At 9:30 p.m., she drafted a memo to the District 7 Chief of Response recommending elevated monitoring and consideration of a formal investigation into potential unusual marine activity along Florida's Gulf and Atlantic coasts. The memo was reviewed and filed. No formal investigation was initiated. The official position remained that the sightings likely represented misidentified marine mammals, possibly a pod of dolphins exhibiting atypical surface behavior, and that the apparent pattern was the result of increased observer attention following initial reports. But Lieutenant Commander Voss kept tracking the data. And when the 6th sighting came in less than 18 hours later, this time from Florida's Atlantic coast near Fort Lauderdale, she knew 2 things with certainty. First, whatever was creating these reports had rounded the southern tip of Florida and was now moving north along the state's opposite coastline. Second, it was heading directly toward Miami. 5 encounters in 4 days. Different beaches, different witnesses, different times of day. But when marine biologist Dr. Sarah Chen plotted the locations on a coastal map at the request of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, something became immediately apparent. The sightings formed a line: Clearwater Beach on day 1, 23 miles south, the Tampa Bay encounter on day 2. The fishing charter reported their sighting 41 miles further south off Anna Maria Island. The Coast Guard patrol documented their encounter 67 miles beyond that near Sarasota. The 5th report came from Venice Beach, another 32 miles down the coast, 163 miles in 4 days. A consistent southern trajectory along Florida's Gulf Coast, averaging 40 miles per day. Dr. Chen, who had spent 17 years studying dolphin migration patterns in these same waters, recognized what she was looking at. This wasn't random. This was directional movement. Marine species travel coastlines for specific reasons. Gray whales follow the Pacific shoreline from Alaska to Baja California, using depth contours and water temperature gradients as navigational guides. Hammerhead sharks migrate along continental shelves, tracking prey concentrations. Even manatees, the perennial explanation for mermaid sightings, follow predictable routes between warm water refuges and feeding grounds. But nothing Dr. Chen had studied moved quite like this. 40 miles per day exceeds typical manatee travel speeds by a factor of 3. Dolphins can cover that distance easily, but they move in pods, their routes dictated by prey availability rather than straight-line coastal tracking. And no known marine mammal exhibits the specific surface behavior described by multiple witnesses. vertical observation, extended periods with head and shoulders above water, that peculiar swimming motion several witnesses compared to a human performing butterfly stroke. The charter captain who reported Encounter 3 had mentioned the entity appeared to be staying in relatively shallow water, 50 to 70 feet, close enough to bottom structure to potentially use underwater topography for navigation. If true, that detail eliminated several conventional explanations. Large sharks rarely linger in that depth range during daylight hours. Dolphins and manatees don't restrict themselves to such precise depth corridors. Dr. Chen marked the 5 locations with red pins. Then she extended the line southward. If the pattern held, if the entity maintained its current trajectory and speed, the projection intersected with Fort Lauderdale within 24 hours. Beyond that, Miami Beach. Dense population centers, public beaches, piers extending hundreds of feet into the Atlantic, crowded with tourists and locals casting fishing lines into water that was about to carry something none of them expected. The pattern suggested intention. Random wandering doesn't produce straight-line coastal progression. Neither does aimless hunting. The entity was traveling somewhere, using Florida's coastline as a guide, maintaining depth and distance parameters that kept it within a specific environmental corridor. Marine species migrate for 3 primary reasons: breeding, feeding, or seasonal temperature regulation. North to south movement along Florida's Gulf Coast in late spring aligned with exactly none of the established migration patterns Dr. Chen knew. Most species traveling these waters at this time of year were heading north, following warming temperatures and prey concentrations toward summer feeding grounds. Whatever this was, it was moving against the biological current. The Coast Guard had logged the time of their encounter at 14:37. The Venice Beach sighting occurred at 18:52, 4 hours and 15 minutes later, 32 miles south. That implied sustained travel at 7.5 miles per hour. Dolphins routinely cruise faster, so do most large sharks. But maintaining that exact pace over distance, staying close to shore, surfacing repeatedly in ways that invited observation, that combination remained unusual. Dr. Chen had reviewed the limited footage from Encounter 2, the surfer's shaky smartphone video showing something breaking the surface approximately 80 yards offshore. The clip lasted 6 seconds. In that time, the entity surfaced, remained visible for approximately 3 seconds, then submerged. Standard dolphin surfacing behavior involves a rolling motion, the dorsal fin breaking water in a smooth arc. What the surfer captured showed a more abrupt appearance, vertical emergence, shoulders clearing the water, a moment of apparent stillness, then a dive that left barely any surface disturbance. She'd watched those 6 seconds 43 times. Each viewing reinforced the same uncomfortable conclusion. This wasn't behaving like any marine mammal she'd studied. The geographic progression created a timeline problem. If the entity reached Fort Lauderdale, it would encounter one of the most densely trafficked recreational waterways in Florida. Boats, jet skis, swimmers, fishing charters, Coast Guard patrols, commercial vessels, thousands of potential witnesses operating in relatively confined waters. Whatever had remained partially hidden along the less populated sections of the Gulf Coast would find no such anonymity near Miami. Dr. Chen understood what the pattern meant. Either the entity would alter its route, moving into deeper water to avoid detection, or it would continue into an environment where remaining unseen became virtually impossible. Both outcomes carried implications. Changing course suggested awareness, calculation, an understanding of human presence and observation. Continuing forward suggested something else entirely. She extended the projection one more time, tracking the line through Fort Lauderdale, past Miami Beach, down toward the Keys. The entity was heading somewhere. The question was whether it would reach that destination before someone captured footage definitive enough to eliminate every conventional explanation. 24 hours later, Encounter 6 would provide the answer. The sixth sighting occurred at 7:18 on day 5, 3 miles offshore from Fort Lauderdale, exactly where Dr. Chen's projection predicted. The witness was Melissa Torres, a marine construction inspector conducting a routine assessment of an artificial reef installation. She was alone on a 24-foot center console, anchored in 63 feet of water, when something surfaced 40 yards from her starboard side. Torres had worked marine construction for 9 years. She knew the difference between dolphins and manatees and sharks. She knew how light refracted through water, how waves created illusions, how distance and angle distorted perception. What surfaced near her boat was none of the things she knew. She grabbed her phone and started recording. The footage runs 1 minute and 47 seconds. Unlike the brief, shaky clips from earlier encounters, Torres maintained relatively steady framing throughout. The entity surfaces 3 times during the recording. Each time it remains visible for 5 to 8 seconds before submerging with minimal disturbance. Torres posted the video to her Instagram account at 8:43, 95 minutes after the encounter. She included minimal commentary. "Something off Lauderdale Reef this morning, can't explain it. Not a dolphin, not a manatee. Watch the movement." She tagged the location, added hashtag Florida Wildlife and hashtag Marine Life, and continued her inspection work. The video accumulated 63 views in the first hour. By noon, it had been shared to 4 local Florida Facebook groups. By 1500, it had crossed into Reddit's r/cryptozoology and r/high-strangeness communities. By 1800, the view count exceeded 47,000. What made Torres's footage significant wasn't just the clarity or duration, it was the timing. Her encounter occurred precisely where the pattern predicted it would. The comment section filled with people who had followed the previous sightings, who recognized the trajectory, who understood they were watching not an isolated oddity, but the continuation of something that had been traveling down the coast for days. The social media cascade created a secondary phenomenon. By mid-afternoon on day 5, approximately 200 people had positioned themselves along the Fort Lauderdale coastline, scanning the water with binoculars, smartphones ready. The pier at Commercial Boulevard saw its parking lot fill by 16:30. Beach access points from Pompano to Hollywood experienced unusual afternoon crowds, groups of people standing at the waterline watching. This created a research problem. When hundreds of witnesses actively search for something specific, the likelihood of primed misidentification increases dramatically. A dolphin fin becomes something else. A patch of seaweed floating in unusual formation becomes suspicious. The human brain, expecting to see something, finds it whether it exists or not. But the inverse also held true. 200 observers with smartphones represented 200 data collection points, 200 potential angles of documentation. If the entity continued its southern trajectory, if it maintained its coastal route, it would pass through the most thoroughly monitored section of Florida coastline in the state's history. Marine biologist Dr. Chen received a call from the FWC at 14:22, asking her to review Torres's footage. She watched it 6 times before responding. The entity's surfacing behavior matched descriptions from previous encounters: vertical emergence, extended time above water, minimal surface disturbance on dive. The swimming motion, visible briefly when the entity moved between surfaces, showed the same unusual pattern the charter captain had described, something like butterfly stroke, undulation originating from the torso rather than a tail. Dr. Chen's written assessment, submitted to the FWC at 16:07, concluded with careful language. The subject exhibits locomotion inconsistent with known marine mammals in Florida waters. Movement patterns suggest conscious surfacing rather than respiration-driven behavior. recommend continued monitoring and documentation. What she didn't include in her official assessment was the observation that had taken her 3 viewings to accept. The entity appeared to be watching the boat. During the second surfacing, visible at 0:34 in Torres's video, the entity's head turned slightly, tracking the boat's position. The motion was subtle, but deliberate. Dolphins orient toward boats out of curiosity or learned behavior around fishing vessels. What Torres captured looked different, slower, more measured, as though the entity was assessing rather than approaching. By evening, 3 local news stations had run brief segments on the unusual sightings along Florida's coast. 2 mentioned Torres's video. None connected it to the geographic pattern or the 4-day progression. The story remained regional, contained within South Florida's social media and news ecosystem. But the witnesses gathering along the coastline understood something the news reports hadn't grasped. This wasn't a random event. Something was moving down the coast, something that had traveled more than 200 miles in 5 days, something that kept surfacing in ways that invited observation. And if the pattern held, it wasn't finished. The 7th encounter, occurring just 5 hours after Torres's video went viral, would prove them correct, and the 8th, the one that would finally bring definitive footage, was now less than 24 hours away. The 7th sighting came in at 2:47 p.m., 3 hours and 18 minutes after the Fort Lauderdale incident. Daniel Ortega had worked Miami-Dade Fire Rescue Marine operations for 11 years. He'd pulled bodies from the water, coordinated search grids through hurricane debris, and supervised dive teams in conditions that grounded civilian boats. On the afternoon of Day 5, he was conducting a routine coastal patrol south of Haulover Beach when his radio operator, Lisa Chen, called his attention to something moving parallel to their vessel. Ortega's incident report, filed at 3:12 p.m. and later obtained through public records request, contains language uncharacteristic of standard marine observations. He describes the entity as maintaining a sustained speed of approximately 15 knots, faster than any human swimmer, comparable to a dolphin in open water, but exhibiting what he termed biphasic propulsion. The report specifies forward motion appeared to alternate between vertical tail propulsion and a swimming stroke utilizing upper appendages, pattern inconsistent with known cetacean locomotion. Ortega's vessel approached to within 40 meters. Chen, operating the radio, stopped mid-transmission to her dispatcher. The incident report notes that both observers maintained visual contact for approximately 90 seconds before the entity submerged and did not resurface within their observation range. What makes Ortega's account particularly significant is what he was trained to do in that moment and chose not to do. Standard protocol for unidentified marine contacts requires radioing coordinates to nearby vessels, maintaining pursuit if safe to do so, and documenting the encounter with onboard recording equipment. Ortega did none of these things. His report acknowledges this departure from procedure with a single sentence. Observer judgment determined that standard contact protocol was not applicable to observed phenomenon. Chen's supplementary statement, filed separately, provides additional context. She describes a moment of what she calls cognitive dissonance when her training, years of identifying marine mammals, debris, and swimmers in distress, encountered something that fit no existing category. She writes, "I have logged over 800 hours of coastal observation. I have never hesitated to classify what I was seeing until that afternoon." The geographic significance cannot be ignored. The 7th sighting placed the entity approximately 16 miles south of the 6th encounter, maintaining the southern trajectory that had characterized its movement since Clearwater. But now it was operating in waters where coastal population density increased exponentially. Haulover Beach to the north, South Beach to the south. This was no longer remote coastline, visited by occasional fishing charters and early morning surfers. This was a stretch of water where thousands of swimmers, kayakers, and boaters converged daily. Marine biologist Dr. Rebecca Torres, reviewing the geographic data 3 days after the incidents concluded, noted the movement pattern's consistency. If we plot these sightings temporally and spatially, we're looking at an average southward progression of approximately 40 miles per day, maintaining close proximity to the coastline rather than moving into deeper water. That alone is unusual. Most large marine animals following the Florida coast are migrating, and migration routes typically follow thermal gradients and food sources in deeper water, not the littoral zone. Torres stopped short of speculating on what the witnesses had seen, but she emphasized one point repeatedly. Whatever moved down that coastline was not behaving like any cataloged marine species I'm familiar with. The movement pattern suggests intention rather than drift or passive migration. The afternoon of Day 5 marked a shift in how the encounters were being processed. The first 6 sightings had been treated as isolated anomalies, strange, unsettling, but contained within the realm of misidentification or unusual marine mammal behavior. Ortega's report changed that calculation. This was a trained emergency responder whose job required accurate marine identification, filing an incident report that essentially stated, "I don't know what I saw, and nothing in my training accounts for it." By 4 p.m., 3 separate Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission vessels had been redirected to patrol the corridor between Miami Beach and Key Biscayne. Radio traffic from that afternoon, later reviewed by local news outlets, reveals coordination typically reserved for search and rescue operations or hazardous marine life warnings. Officers were instructed to maintain visual sweeps of coastal waters and report any unusual marine activity directly to dispatch rather than logging it through standard channels. What they were searching for remained officially undefined. Internal communication referred to it only as the unidentified contact. At 4:35 p.m., a Miami Beach lifeguard station received a call from a civilian reporting something large moving in the water, approximately 200 meters offshore. 2 guards responded, scanning with binoculars for the standard concerns: distressed swimmer, shark, debris. They saw nothing. The caller, who declined to provide her name, insisted she had watched something surface briefly, described it as having a human shape but wrong, and then disconnected. The lifeguards logged it as a possible hoax call. But the timing places it within the projected southern trajectory, and the location falls precisely in line with where the entity would be if it maintained its established pattern. By sunset on Day 5, 7 encounters had been reported across 5 days, spanning over 280 miles of Florida coastline. What had begun as isolated oddities witnessed by individuals who doubted their own eyes had become a documented pattern involving trained observers, official reports, and a coordinated search effort. But nobody was searching the right place. The entity had already moved further south, entering the most populated stretch of coastline in Florida. And in less than 18 hours, it would surface in a location where concealment was impossible, where dozens of witnesses would film from fixed positions, and where the distance between observer and observed would collapse entirely. The 8th encounter was coming, and it would happen in broad daylight in front of a crowd at a public pier where people had gathered for reasons having nothing to do with searching for something impossible. The South Point Pier extends 450 feet into the Atlantic from the southern tip of Miami Beach. On any given morning, it hosts joggers, fishermen, tourists photographing cruise ships, and locals who come for the view of Government Cut, where maritime traffic enters the port. At 9:17 a.m. on Day 6, it hosted something else. Approximately 60 people were on the pier when the first shout came from the northeastern corner. A fisherman, later identified as Carlos Ruiz, a retired contractor who fished the pier 4 mornings a week, pointed at the water roughly 30 feet from the pier's edge and yelled for others to look. Within seconds, a dozen people had moved to the railing. What happened next was filmed from at least 8 different positions. The convergence of multiple simultaneous recordings from fixed angles provides something absent from every previous encounter: corroboration of specific details from independent perspectives. When a single witness describes an anomaly, skepticism is warranted. When 8 witnesses filming from different positions capture overlapping footage showing the same phenomenon, the calculus changes. Jennifer Howe, a tourist from Seattle, was filming the sunrise when she pivoted her phone toward the disturbance. Her footage, later posted to social media and subsequently downloaded before she made her account private, shows approximately 43 seconds of continuous recording. The video is shaky. She was holding her phone at arm's length, attempting to zoom, but the subject remains in frame for the entire duration. The entity surfaced approximately 28 feet from the pier. Distance estimation comes from comparing its position to structural elements of known dimensions visible in the footage. Howe's video shows a shape breaking the waterline. For the first 4 seconds, only a dark mass is visible, the kind of ambiguous shape that, in isolation, could be dismissed as debris, marine mammal, or photographic artifact. But at the 5-second mark, the shape rises higher and the frame captures structural detail. The upper portion of the entity appeared humanoid in configuration. Multiple witnesses interviewed separately in the hours following the coastline incident used variations of the same description: shoulders, arms, a torso that tapered in a way consistent with human proportion. But the scale was wrong. Comparing the entity's visible portion to the pier railing in the background suggests a shoulder width of approximately 3 feet. Michael Park, a marine biology graduate student from the University of Miami, who happened to be on the pier photographing seabirds, captured a series of still images with a camera capable of telephoto focus. Park's photos, though not released publicly, were reviewed by investigators and described in subsequent interviews. He stated that the images showed bilateral symmetry in the upper body, musculature consistent with an organism adapted for swimming, and pigmentation that appeared mottled, darker on the dorsal surface, lighter ventrally, similar to countershading in pelagic species. What separated this encounter from the previous 7 was the duration. The entity remained partially surfaced for over 30 seconds, long enough for witnesses to process what they were seeing, long enough for hands to steady and cameras to focus. At the 12-second mark of Howe's footage, the entity turned. Several witnesses described this moment specifically. The turning motion revealed a profile, and for approximately 2 seconds, the side of what multiple witnesses described as a head was visible. The anatomical structure appeared elongated, the neck proportionally longer than human anatomy would predict. No clear facial features are discernible in any of the available footage. The distance and resolution limitations prevent that level of detail. But witnesses standing at different positions along the pier reported seeing what they interpreted as eyes and a defined jawline. This is where witness accounts begin to fracture, not in contradiction, but in the limits of perception. Some witnesses focused on the head, others on the movement of the upper limbs, others on the lower portion that remained submerged. What they all agree on is what happened next. At approximately the 18-second mark, the entity submerged, not in the way a swimmer dives, and not in the passive sinking of an object losing buoyancy. Multiple witnesses described the motion as a downward pull, an active descent that suggested powerful propulsion from below. Howe's footage captures a final dorsal view, a triangular shape breaking the surface for less than a second before disappearing, leaving a turbulent swirl in the water. Then it was gone. The pier erupted. Witnesses shouted overlapping questions. compared what they had seen, and several immediately called 911. Others remained at the railing, filming the empty water where the entity had been, as if expecting it to resurface. It did not. Miami Beach police arrived at 9:34 a.m., 17 minutes after the initial sighting. Officer Stephanie Kwan, first on scene, found a crowd still gathered at the northeastern corner, many still recording the water. Her incident report describes approximately 40 witnesses claiming to have observed an unidentified marine animal or object in close proximity to the pier. She interviewed 6 witnesses on site, noted the consistency of their descriptions, and radioed for Marine Unit support. By 10 a.m., a Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission vessel was conducting sweeps of the area. By 11 a.m., a second vessel had joined. They found nothing. Dr. Samuel Ortiz, a marine mammal specialist with NOAA, was contacted that afternoon and asked to review available footage. His preliminary assessment, provided informally and not as an official agency statement, acknowledged that the videos showed an unidentified organism exhibiting morphology inconsistent with known Atlantic marine mammals. He declined to speculate further, noting that definitive identification requires clearer imagery or physical evidence. What the 8th encounter provided was not clarity, it provided specificity. For the first time, witnesses had observed the entity in conditions that eliminated many conventional explanations. The distance was too close to blame atmospheric distortion. The lighting was full daylight. The observation duration was long enough for trained observers like Park to focus cameras and document detail. And the sheer number of independent witnesses filming simultaneously meant that claims of misidentification or hoax collapsed under the weight of corroboration. But specificity is not the same as understanding. The footage raised more questions than it answered. What moved through the water that morning possessed characteristics that defied easy categorization: humanoid structure, combined with aquatic adaptation, behavior that suggested awareness of the observers, and propulsion mechanics that left marine biologists unable to provide a satisfying terrestrial explanation. And then, as suddenly as the 5-day pattern had begun, it stopped. No 9th encounter was reported. No further sightings followed. Whatever had moved down Florida's coastline, drawing closer to populated areas with each successive day, had vanished after its most public appearance. The pier footage exists in 93 seconds of shaky smartphone video shot by at least 7 different witnesses from fixed positions along a 200-foot stretch of concrete. That geographical spread matters. Whatever moved through the water passed beneath multiple vantage points simultaneously, which eliminates the single observer misidentification problem that plagues most cryptid encounters. Start with what we can verify. The timestamp metadata places all recordings between 3:47 and 3:51 p.m. on day 5. Weather Service data confirms clear conditions, full sunlight, water visibility rated at 22 feet. The pier structure itself provides scale reference, standard piling spacing of 12 feet, concrete deck height of 18 feet above mean high water. These aren't estimates. They're measurements we can check against municipal construction records. The primary footage comes from Marcus Chen, a marine biology student from University of Miami who had driven down specifically after seeing Encounter 7 on social media. His credentials matter here. He's trained to observe aquatic life. He knows what dolphins look like in motion, what manatees look like when they surface, what debris looks like when current catches it wrong. He filmed for 41 seconds before his phone battery died. What his footage shows? A shape moving parallel to the pier at estimated depth of 8 to 10 feet. The water clarity on March 14th was exceptional. You can see the shadow it cast on the sandy bottom. That shadow suggests length of roughly 6 to 7 feet. Movement pattern is what Chen flagged immediately. not the up-down undulation of a dolphin, not the slow drift of a manatee. Something closer to the lateral S-curve of an eel, but scaled up impossibly large and moving with what Chen later calculated as approximately 12 miles per hour based on known pier length and frame count. The second piece of footage shows the same entity from the opposite angle, 40 feet down the pier. This one comes from Sarah Morrison, a tourist from Ohio with no marine background, just an iPhone 13 and steady hands. Her 26 seconds of video captured the moment it changed direction. Marine mammals don't corner like that. The turn radius was too tight. Morrison's husband, visible in her footage's audio, says, "What the hell is that?" 3 times. His voice carries no excitement, just confusion. Then there's the breach. 18 seconds of footage from a third witness, name withheld at their request, shows something breaking the surface approximately 30 feet from the pier's end. This is where testimony diverges from what the camera can definitively prove. The witness claims they saw a face, definitely a face, and shoulders. The footage shows water displacement, a dark shape, motion blur. Frame-by-frame analysis reveals curvature inconsistent with a dolphin's melon, but the resolution degrades precisely where definition matters most. Coast Guard Lieutenant Ramirez, who reviewed all footage within 6 hours of the incident, noted in his preliminary report that the subject demonstrates locomotion patterns not consistent with known marine mammals in this region. He stopped short of classification. Official Coast Guard position remains unidentified marine animal. Marine biologists at Florida Atlantic University examined the same footage. Their analysis, unpublished but leaked through academic channels, acknowledged 3 details they couldn't reconcile with conventional species: the turning radius, the depth consistency, and what they termed possible bilateral symmetry in upper body structure. That last phrase is careful language for something they didn't want to name directly. The conventional explanations circle close, but never quite land. Dolphin with unusual coloration swimming in tandem, possible, except the shadow suggests single organism. Manatee in unusually clear water, moving unusually fast, biomechanically problematic given their typical 3 to 5 mile per hour cruising speed. Large shark species doesn't account for the surface behavior or the witness reports of upper body structure. What the footage doesn't show matters as much as what it does. No clear anatomical details. No definitive proof of human-like features. No tail visible in any frame. Just movement, shadow, displacement, and the aggregate testimony of witnesses who all saw something but can't quite agree on what that something was. The official Coast Guard incident report, filed March 15th, classified the encounter as unidentified marine life, investigation ongoing. 3 months later, that status hasn't changed. Requests for follow-up information receive identical response. The matter remains under review by appropriate authorities. No authorities are named. No timeline is given. The investigation exists in bureaucratic suspension. Local marine patrols increased for exactly 2 weeks after the pier incident, then quietly returned to standard deployment patterns. If ongoing monitoring continues, it's not visible to the public. The silence feels deliberate. Marcus Chen's footage accumulated 2.3 million views across 3 platforms before he made it private. He won't discuss why. His university issued no official statement, but Chen is no longer listed on the marine biology program's student roster. Whether he left voluntarily or faced academic pressure remains unclear. He declined interview requests for this investigation. Sarah Morrison's footage stayed public longer. It's been analyzed by everyone from certified marine biologists to conspiracy theorists with video editing software. The comment sections became war zones, believers demanding acknowledgement, skeptics citing pareidolia, and mass hysteria. Morrison eventually deleted her social media accounts. Her husband told one reporter they just wanted to forget the whole thing. The unnamed witness who captured the breach never came forward publicly. Their footage circulates through secondary uploads, metadata stripped, origin obscured. We know it came from the pier that day only because it appears in Lieutenant Ramirez's report timestamp log. 4 of the other pier witnesses recanted within a month. Not that they didn't see something, just that they couldn't be sure what it was and didn't want to contribute to misinformation. The language sounds coached. Whether they faced pressure or simply buckled under social cost is impossible to determine. The fishing charter captain from day 3 lost 11 advance bookings in the 2 weeks after his television interview. His business recovered, but he won't discuss the sighting anymore. "I saw what I saw," he told a follow-up caller, then hung up. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission maintains they found no evidence of unusual species presence during their investigation. They won't specify what that investigation entailed. Their marine incident database for March shows standard entries: boat accidents, fishing violations, 1 manatee injury. The 5-day encounter sequence appears nowhere in official record. This pattern repeats through maritime history. Unexplained sightings that generate initial attention, then sink beneath institutional silence and witness exhaustion. The 1956 Gulf Coast sightings followed identical trajectory. So did the 1978 Pensacola incidents. Initial reports, media coverage, then evaporation into rumor and archived newspaper clippings that researchers dig up decades later. But the ocean keeps its inventory private, 80% unmapped. Average depth of 12,000 feet. The megamouth shark remained unknown to science until 1976, despite weighing 15 feet and 1,500 pounds. A new whale species was confirmed in 2021. We're still cataloging what lives down there. Something moved along Florida's coast for 5 days, visible enough to generate 8 separate encounters, documented enough to produce footage, credible enough to involve Coast Guard personnel. Then it was gone, or it went deeper, or it was never what witnesses thought they saw. The question isn't whether mermaids exist. The question is what actually moved through those waters, why multiple trained observers couldn't classify it, and why the investigation closed before it produced answers. The footage remains. The witness testimony remains. The conventional explanations that almost fit but don't quite, those remain too. Florida's coastline stretches 350 miles, most of it touching water we've barely explored. Whatever appeared in those 5 days came from that unmapped territory and returned to it. The 8th encounter gave us better documentation than any previous sighting. It still wasn't enough. The ocean keeps its secrets even when we're watching.